Time doesn't erase murder. It just hides it better. They said the case was closed. They said no one was watching. But someone always is. This is Santana True Crime.
Welcome to Santana True Crime. Tonight, I've got New York Times bestselling author Caitlin Rother. Caitlin spent about 12 years investigating the McStay family murder, which I'm sure a lot of people have heard of. And that's why she is the authority on the subject. And she wrote a book called Down to the Bone. Caitlin, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Caitlin, you're a New York Times bestselling author. I'm sure that you have plenty of options about which cases you want to investigate. I believe you put out 16 books, all really good. What about this case was most appealing to you?
Well, okay, so when I pick a book, so my 16th book is coming out in January, and it's going to be a series of thrillers. So we can talk about that later in the show if you want. But this is my 15th book. So when I pick a story, I mean, I live in San Diego. Obviously, San Diego big high profile cases are the ones I'm going to gravitate toward because they're local. This is where I live. This is where the courthouses are. And so, you know, I don't know about you, but when I pick a true crime case to write a book about, I've got to be able to research it. And it's nice to be able to drive to wherever I need to go, right? So this started out as a missing persons case, and it was really big in the news. And I, you know, was obviously caught my attention because it's a family of 4 that went missing, which is highly unusual. The only other family that I've ever heard of that went missing was, and they were also found in the desert, I believe, but they were in their car. I don't know if you remember this case, but it turned out that the guy was kind of a spy. Anyway, they were found dead in their car, and I don't remember the details, like if they were shot. That's the only other family that I can ever think of that went missing in its entirety. Usually it's a child or a mother or a teenager. So that caught my eye. And then, you know, over time, you know, I have to be looking for cases, and there just weren't a lot more of them that kind of hit the level of interest. So I'm looking for emotional resonance with the community. And then, you know, as time went on, and then they later found this family's skeletal remains in the desert 4 years, almost 4 years later. It took on a little bit of a difference because our sheriff's department obviously did not make the right call on this case. So the book that I picked to write about before this, same homicide units, same sheriff's department, same allegations of confirmation bias. So when I was originally writing true crime books, I was mostly just writing them in a straightforward way. I had to have a conviction or you can't get a deal. But for the publishers don't want liability, you know, can't just go around accusing people who have never been arrested or whatever. So got to wait for a conviction or some kind of court resolution. Usually they're pretty straightforward. There's a conviction. There's a guy who's accused. He goes to death row or, you know, life on without parole. Here's what the prosecution said. Boom. But the last 2 books that I've written have been different. This one and my previous book, Death on Ocean Boulevard, like I said, same homicide unit, same sheriff's department, same allegations of confirmation bias, which I think you probably know what they are, but let me explain for your viewers. When investigators get a premise or piece of evidence or a theory, and they won't let go of it despite contrary evidence, or that they can't support it with enough evidence to really back it up, but they still stubbornly hold on to it. That's what the allegations were in this case by the defense of the man who was eventually arrested and convicted and put on death row. And in the previous book, which was the Rebecca Zahau case, a woman who was found naked, bound, and gagged outside of hanging from a rear courtyard in Coronado, which is also local here. And the family thought she was murdered, but the sheriff's department insisted on saying that she killed herself. So these two cases really caught my eye because when I was a reporter, I was an investigative reporter, and my beat was basically government and political stories about incompetence, wrongdoing, corruption, that kind of thing. So these two stories caught my eye eventually because of that angle, but I didn't know that when I started out. So it was, the missing family, then there was arrest, and their bodies were found out in the desert. So the first sheriff's department got it wrong. Second sheriff's department arrested this guy within a year. And then the trial ended up having a bunch of conflicts and discrepancies in the prosecution's case, which my book also focuses on. So it's more of an investigative. Um, it's I write narrative nonfiction, which reads more like a novel, but this book is actually a lot more investigative. So I'm laying out all the evidence, and I don't take a position, but I just want the reader to be able to see what evidence got into the trial, what evidence didn't get into the trial, and come to a decision on their own on who they think did it, or maybe we don't even know in the book who. Maybe there's no one in the book who actually did it that I'm identifying. So it's a suspenseful mystery, kind of a true crime thriller.
Yeah, and we talked about this before the show, but that is what is different about your book than what people are going to hear on podcast or if they watch a documentary on the McStay murders, is that you really lay out the possibility of the different suspects and what is good about them and what is may prove them to be not guilty. And I thought that that was extremely interesting. And I feel like this is the perfect book to sit around in a book club and have a debate on who is
Thank
your
you.
favorite because you
I
could go
just
on and on.
can I just clarify one thing? The people who are in the book are actually people of interest. They were not ever identified as suspects. So I just want to be careful with the terminology.
Right. So they were never identified as suspects by the police. But as a reader, you're going to read this and you're going to start going through your mind of who do you think was responsible for this? Or was it someone that's not named in the book?
Right.
That's also a possibility.
Yep.
Can we start out with, because you touched on where the bodies were located, but can we start out on that day when they did go missing? We believe that February 4th was the last time that
Could
they
have
were
been
in their
February
home.
4th, could have been February 5th.
So around that time frame.
Mhm.
Can we talk about the police response? Because that is something, as a former law enforcement officer for 2 decades, I found extremely interesting, as well as that initial investigation.
Tell me, what did you find interesting about it?
I'll tell you, from my point of view, when you're going into the house and you believe that a crime has been committed,
Mhm.
if you believe that there's evidence of a crime inside a house, the proper response is to do what they first did, which was to perform a frisk of the house, making sure that no one is in there that's a suspect or is injured. And then your absolute second response should be to lock down that house. And that means you tell everyone to get out. You don't let mom walk in or relatives, family, friends. No one touches anything. No one removes anything from that house. And then you go down and you get a search warrant. And then once that search warrant has been signed off on, again, you're treating this like an art museum. No one's allowed to touch anything. No one's allowed to walk away from anything. And everything has to remain sterile. And that just didn't happen. And I don't want to get on a soapbox here, but I know that, sure, I bet that they went in there and they see these items that are left out. They really don't know the family well, but there's some signs in that house that's, in my opinion, obvious that they did not leave on their own free will. You don't
Okay.
leave your dogs abandoned in the
Right.
backyard.
Right. Okay. So let me
Go
jump
ahead.
in. So yeah, so that was a lot of the criticism that all the things you're saying. And so this is what happened. The family disappeared. Last time anyone heard from them was on February 4th, 2010, when Joseph McStay had lunch with one of his two primary business associates. He had two. One was Dan Kavanaugh, who took care of the website for the business, and the business was selling waterfalls that hang on the wall or whatever, in an office kind of a thing, or maybe in a home. But for a lot of offices, they were making these waterfalls. And the guy who actually made the waterfalls, custom waterfalls, Chase Merritt. Okay, so he had lunch with Chase Merritt on that day, in Rancho Cucamonga, which is about an hour and a half away from his house in Fallbrook, where he lived with his family. And his cell phone records prove that he drove up there. He's on the phone with Chase Merritt. His phone is in Rancho Cucamonga for 90 minutes. And then he drives home and he's calling him again. He's calling him throughout the day. So anyway, after I think around 7:47 was the last time his phone called anybody, and that was Chase Merritt. Chase Merritt did not answer the phone. But at 8 o'clock, he's still on his computer working on a CAD program for a plumbing issue for one of these waterfalls that they had been discussing all day. That's according to Chase Merritt. Okay, so that was the last time anyone heard from them. After that day, there's no activity on their credit cards. There's no activity on their cell phones, and no one sees them. So days go by. Dan Kavanaugh's trying to reach him. Chase Merritt is trying to reach him. They can't reach him. He's not answering phone calls. He's not answering emails. So Dan Kavanaugh calls the sheriff's department and reports this and says it's not like him. Can you do a welfare check? Chase Merritt contacts the family. Joseph's mother actually drives to her house, but they don't know where they went. And I guess they disappeared on a vacation one time and didn't tell anybody. So they didn't think it was a crime necessarily right away. Okay, so nobody knew where they went, and they were obviously thinking they were going to come back. So Michael McStay, the brother, doesn't really want to report this to the police until they give him some time, because maybe it was a Valentine's Day vacation, maybe it was this, maybe it was that. So by the time Chase Merritt could convince him to go over to the house, it was February 13th. So that's 9 days later. They go into the house and they see food left out on the counter, eggs in the carton, breakfast kind of half eaten. There's coffee in the pot. The dogs, like you mentioned, were left outside in the backyard without food or water, although by this point some neighbor was feeding them. And so Michael McStay was like, well, maybe they did make arrangements and they're coming back, and they, talked to a neighbor to have them fed or whatever. But they couldn't find any clues in the house what was going on. The house was locked, so he climbed in an office window. 2 days later, finally, he was persuaded to call the sheriff's department. So he goes over to the house with a deputy. They walk through the house. They see the same thing, the eggs. But there's no sign of foul play. There's no obvious sign of foul play. There's no blood, not a speck of blood anywhere, which becomes very important later in the case. But it's been now 11 days. And so after 10 days, if the family's missing, they can report it to the homicide unit. The homicide unit is the same unit that does missing persons case in the sheriff's department here. So they called out the homicide team, and a homicide detective and his partner came out, also did a walkthrough in the house, saw the same thing, the eggs, the, dogs outside, etc. But the family didn't think that something bad had happened. Therefore, the detective said, well, he wasn't sure either. So it wasn't a crime scene. So I can't believe I'm actually in defense mode here of the sheriff's department at this point. But because there were no actual signs of true crime, it just seemed pretty weird that they just left everything in the middle like that. They were also painting the kitchen. and there was a paint tray where there was a roller in it and nobody had cleaned up. So it was literally dried in the paint tray as if somebody had stopped painting in the middle of painting, right? It wasn't, there was, it wasn't cleaned up. It was just, who leaves a paint tray like that? You don't, right? You wash your roller if you're continuing to paint. So yeah, so it was a weird situation, but there was nothing specific that they could point to that said foul play. So he did not secure the house. He did not tell the family he was going to get a search warrant. And so the next morning, the mom came over and cleaned everything up. Cleaned up all the dishes, put away threw the coffee away from the pot, put all the kitchen back together that had been, the cabinets were out, the drawers were out, there was blue tape, they were in the middle painting, the paint supplies, she moved them all around, she rearranged the furniture, she did everything she possibly could to alter the scene. And not on purpose, because she didn't know any better. And, a friend came who was actually helping the family paint, and he goes, "Are you sure you should be doing that? Aren't, haven't have the police been here?" And she goes, "Oh, they were already here." So, so basically, because there was no blood, because there was no obvious sign of foul play, it was just sort of a weird situation. The judge, when he did go ahead and get a search warrant, said, "You have no probable cause here. I'm not giving you any more search warrants." So that's his side of things, that they didn't know that the family had been killed. In the search warrant, though, in the very beginning, he did say he thought there was foul play. Even though there was no obvious signs of it, he was trying to argue that, and the judge shut him down. So it would have been really good, though, if the mom didn't do that.
Yeah. Do you think that a part of this is that Michael and the family minimizing the clutter in the house and the dogs being left out? Because if you came to my house and eggs were left out and you had a half-eaten apple on a stair and there's popcorn out and my dog is outside, I would hope that someone would say, "Wait a minute, he does not leave his house where like that." And his wife would kill him for leaving the house like this. So something's happened.
And I think that was pointed out, but so is that the detective's fault? Whose fault is that? I don't really know. All I know is the detective was definitely criticized for not securing the house. And he said, "Well, I didn't want to scare them. I wanted them to trust me. And they didn't seem to think that anything bad had happened. And so I still needed to get information from them. And that's why he didn't push harder." So, I mean, I can kind of see both sides at that point. But as time went on, when they didn't show up and they couldn't find them, and they didn't come back, even the next set of detectives, the lead detective in San Bernardino, I said, "Well, what do you think about that?" And he goes, "Well, I would have gone back. I would have gone back to the judge or a different judge,
Right.
tried again, because time had passed and they still didn't come back. So obviously something was wrong, but he didn't do that."
Yeah, we used to call it magistrate shopping,
Yeah.
which is, you find the magistrate that is more
Mhm.
lenient, the one that's going to ask you about
Right.
your family and what's going
Right.
on, and then um, going to sign off on your paperwork. There were some items that were, I don't know if you want to give away all the details, but
Well,
a
try me
few
and I'll
odd
see.
things that happened during this whole process, as well as some
Uh-huh.
things removed from the house by family members.
Right.
And uh, also, there's some odd things that happened, or one odd thing that I found when Michael and Chase went into the house. Do you want to talk about any of those, or you want to save it for the book?
Well, the one thing that did come up that Michael McStay was criticized for, and so was the sheriff's department. Michael McStay, that first night when he came in with the deputy and then then the detective walked through, Michael McStay went back into the house after they had left and took a computer and a camera. And, normally a computer has pretty important information on it for an investigation like this. Um, and so the next day, um, when the mom called the detective, who she did not meet, by the way. Okay, so the way that this worked was Michael McStay, neither mom or Michael McStay, the brother, lived in San Diego County. So Michael McStay lived in Orange County, which is one county north, and the mom was working in Ventura County, which is 3 or 4 hours away. So she drove down that night. She was interviewed by a different set of detectives. So Michael McStay was interviewed by the ones that came to the house. And they were saying, do you have any financial access to his financial records at all? And he said, no, but, do you want me to see if I can find some? And they were like, yes. So I think in his mind, and this is what he said at trial, that he thought he had permission to take that computer. But in the next day, when Susan Blake actually called that same detective who she hadn't talked to before and said, oh, she was cleaning the house, he asked her politely to stop cleaning the house. And when he found out that Michael McStay had taken the computer, he said, and he needs to bring that back before we get there. And I don't know if he was specific, but he said he needs to bring that back because he did come back with a search warrant 4 days later, and the computer had been replaced. But that was an issue, and Michael McStay, it raised some suspicions, about the family members. What were they doing, and why was the mom coming into the house and cleaning up? And here's one thing I do want to say, which raised suspicions later. She didn't say anything about this at the time. She waited until the house was going into foreclosure to tell the detective that Joseph McStay had something like $60,000 in cash that he had not declared to the IRS as income that was possibly hidden in the house. So all these times that she was coming over to clean up, you kind of wonder, was she looking for that money? And is that money maybe a motive for somebody else to come into the house and try to kill them or kidnap them, and because they knew there was money in the house that they could steal? And I'm not blaming her for being a part of that, but she didn't tell the detective anything about that money, and that could have been a possible motive
And
that
that
they
seems
that
to
they
be
needed to know about.
right.
That.
And that is a common theme in this case, is there
Yeah.
are multiple people that could have a financial gain by Joseph being murdered. And that just adds another layer in my mind of things that you have to take into consideration.
Michael McStay apparently was always borrowing money or asking for money, and um, and the dad who lived in Texas had actually helped Joseph McStay out, because Joseph McStay had to declare bankruptcy some years earlier after his first marriage failed, and he was having problems keeping it all together. So his dad helped him out. But then his dad had these debts that the detective found out about later, and it turned out that he had written bad checks and had gambling debts, and so it got messy for all the family members. So when the media didn't necessarily find out about some of these things, but there was some very active amateur sleuthing going on Reddit and on web sleuths. And there was a lot of information coming out on these forums that the detectives, it's not even clear if the detectives even noticed or cared about any of these things that were coming out. But the people who were people of interest had criminal records, and they were all being talked these online forums. And so the newspaper picked up on that, and the media picked up on that. And then the detective ultimately, found out about these things, but it seemed like they would interview some of these people and just kind of move on.
Yeah, and that was one of the frustrating parts of reading this, is that there seems to be more of a lackadaisical approach to this, and how they're being too nice to family members and trying to get too much cooperation instead of saying we are doing X, like we are going to be searching this computer. Um, we
Well,
are searching this house.
and one other thing that struck me was the detective didn't figure this out, that Dan Kavanaugh, who, by the way, a year earlier had sent a series of threatening messages to Joseph McStay that he was going to shut down the business if he didn't pay him money, because he was mad that he found out that Joseph McStay and Chase Merritt had been working on some custom projects on the side and not cutting Dan Kavanaugh in. And so Dan was a concern for Joseph McStay, and he also started taking money from Joseph's PayPal through Joseph's PayPal account before he was even reported missing, things like that. The detective just ignored these things, and then he would get information from the family, and the information actually came from from Dan Kavanaugh, telling the family members these things, but it was as if the detective couldn't figure that out, and he was taking it as information that was coming from the family when it wasn't. It was coming through Dan Kavanaugh to the family, to the detective, and he was looking at it as independent information when it wasn't.
Yeah, can we explain who Dan Kavanaugh was for people that are not familiar with this case? Because
All I can really say is that he was a guy who worked on Joseph McStay's website. He was, his nickname was Hacker Dan.
so
And he Yeah, go ahead.
this is what's really odd about Dan is that his responsibility was to build and maintain a website
And
and to
SEO.
make sure that Google reviews were, or the Google algorithm
Right.
was in sync, where he would be populated to the top of the search engine.
Right. Right.
Okay. Which is what I see as, this is someone that you either outsource to or is an employee. Dan
Well, he
is
wasn't he
claiming
wasn't an employee, and he claimed later, after they went missing, that he was a business partner.
that would be my point.
There is no paperwork anywhere that Joseph ever filed with a city or state agency or on his taxes or in his emails. In fact, to his accountant, he specifically said that he was, working as a sole proprietor. Again, the detectives ignored that as well and just took Dan Kavanaugh at his word that he was a business partner, which just was his word. And he felt like one. He felt like he put this business together and that he was responsible for its success because it was an online business. But the fact of the matter was that if anyone was a partner, it was Joseph's father. And then after they settled up, Joseph went back to working on his own. So, in fact, he was trying to get away from Dan Kavanaugh because of those threats and was trying to expand. He had already outsourced the SEO stuff actually to another contractor. And so Dan Kavanaugh, as I outlined in the book, was making less and less money working for Joseph. And I think that was also an issue for Dan.
And Dan had a lot of access to Joseph's accounts, especially his PayPal account.
Well, he
And
wasn't supposed to.
right, but we know he had access to it,
He
which is
had no
troubling in itself,
authorization
right?
to take money and change words like he did. He told the, surviving family members, the mom and the brother, and they just basically believed him. And he was saying, you got to get rid of Chase Merritt. And Chase Merritt was saying to them, you need to get rid of Dan Kavanaugh. So they were pointing fingers at each other. But the family sided with Dan Kavanaugh for whatever reason, even though Joseph had told them about all those threats and that he had threatened to shut the thing down. And they knew that he was capable of shutting the thing down. So I don't know if it was out of fear or they just couldn't cope, because I know the mom was having a hard time and she was very depressed. She had to take time off work, like a year, because her family just wasn't turning up, and she went looking for them in Mexico. So she was overwhelmed, I think. And, so they let Dan take over the business, and then he did. And then he sold it without any authorization. And again, didn't give them any of the money that he got from selling the business. So that's Dan Kavanaugh in a nutshell.
Yeah, and the people that he sold it to, that's an interesting story too, which I'm glad your book has covered, because
Yeah,
that
I
kind of
was really
demands another theory of why he may have
yes.
been killed.
I thought that that was fascinating. I dedicated like a chapter to this because it really didn't get before the jury very much. The defense tried. Okay, so the defense tried to do a third party culpability case, which means that it's not my client that did it. It's this other person, but the judge wouldn't let them do it. You have to have permission from the judge to do one of these cases. So they did everything they could to put it on anyway, even though they didn't have official permission to do a third party culpability case. So anytime they could bring in information about Dan's um, financial benefits, that how much money he took from the company. So for example, they had an expert go through all of his bank accounts and stuff, and it was only a limited time period. So the case against Chase Merritt from the prosecution was that he was stealing money from Joseph, and Joseph found out about it, fired him on February 4th at lunch. Merritt came back to the house with him somehow, or came back later in the day, killed him, killed the family, and then drove away in his truck with the bodies in the back that evening. Okay, so that's the prosecution's theory. And I forgot where I was going. Okay, so yes, so Dan Kavanaugh sold the business. So after that, he was running this business, and let me just, I know what I was going to say. Okay, so Chase Merritt allegedly, according to the prosecution, the reason that Joseph fired him was
And you froze
out
up.
that Chase Merritt, they had been registering their custom jobs that cut out Dan Kavanaugh that he was so mad about. Um, QuickBooks also has a capability of printing checks. So before Joseph even disappeared, this started like 2 days before, and Chase Merritt ended up with something like $20,000 in checks that the prosecution said were forged. Chase Merritt said no, it was with Joseph's permission, and it was for these jobs that we were working on. I only did this so I could keep those jobs going, so I could keep working on the waterfalls, because he disappeared, and we had these customers who were waiting for these waterfalls. So $20,000 that he allegedly stole from Joseph, and that's what supposedly got him fired. If you look at Dan Kavanaugh after he took over the business, in a 10-month period, he earned $206,000 that he took from the business, and only spent $59,000 of that to produce waterfalls. The rest of that he spent on going to nightclubs, guitar centers, sushi restaurants, having a good time. And so the defense, after Chase Merritt was arrested, basically said that if you're looking at a financial motive, which they believe that this case is based on just business, all business and all money, Chase Merritt had allegedly taken $20,000, some of which actually was paid to other vendors. Those checks were made out to another vendor, so he didn't even get to keep that money, versus $206,000 that Dan Kavanaugh took in. Why wasn't Dan Kavanaugh even a suspect? And that was the defense's case. So when you look at it, and this case really does seem to be financial, unless it was a drug cartel that ended up killing these people with a sledgehammer to the back of the head, because that's how every one of their skulls had a hole in the back. Is this really about money, or was it something else that they didn't even get into? So Dan Kavanaugh sells this business. After taking it over, he decides to sell it without the authorization or permission of the family to two guys who are in the cannabis business. One of them is operating a weed dispensary, and the other one is involved and was later arrested and indicted in a federal investigation of mailing pot through the mail in boxes. So the defense attorney told me that he thinks they bought this business to put the pot that they were selling across the country in boxes with waterfalls as a cover. And that's why they wanted to buy this business, which they did in a hurry, by the way, over July 4th weekend. And the other curious thing is that Joseph McStay had a gun that he bought some years earlier, and it ended up in the possession of a convicted felon whose car was abandoned at the side of the freeway in Las Vegas. And after the sheriff's detectives interviewed him and traced back where he got the gun, it was from a friend who said he got it from a guy named Big Smoke, who was involved in the cannabis industry, and that this gun had been a burner gun used in a crime that people were trying to get rid of at some kind of like Tupperware party where they're exchanging swords and, glass pipes and pot, which somehow kind of connects back to possibly to these guys who bought the store from Dan Kavanaugh. So these dots were never connected for the jury. The gun was not allowed, and any mention of the gun was not mentioned at trial. So the judge said, you can't talk about that. The two people who bought the business, it was mentioned that some people bought the business, but no information about their backgrounds was allowed in either. So this is all stuff that I investigated and that I found out and that I got from investigative reports from the sheriff's department that I managed to get through the discovery materials that I did not get through public records, by the way. So that's all in the book, and it's all information that all that information never even got to the jury.
Yeah, and again, I'll say this time and time again, that's what differentiates your book from other podcasts and other documentaries, is that this is more than a public record search. You actually, of course, you include things from the trial, even though I know that you said you weren't there, but you got them from the trial transcript, and you've got this kind of inside information. One of the things that
I was also able to watch it, though. There's 225 episodes on YouTube. So even though I wasn't able to physically be in the room for the whole trial, I was there for the prelim, I was there for the opening and closings. But anyone can actually watch these on YouTube right now. So I was able to hear their voices, watch their faces.
What I thought was really odd too about this whole case, and there's several things, is that the prosecution's theory is that the murder occurred at the house, right?
Yes, I
But
think that
yet,
that's huge, which is
yeah,
why I keep saying there was no blood in the house. And if you
right.
know anything about head wounds, you've got a big hole in your scalp, that's going to
It goes everywhere.
splatter
Yeah.
blood everywhere. They did not find a drop. And if it really was that sledgehammer, they had that sledgehammer tested at 2 different points. And there was no DNA on that sledgehammer.
Yeah. Did they spray with luminol during the search
They
warrant?
did not, because they thought they were coming back and it's messy. And at that point, they had no indication of foul play, according to the detective. And therefore, it's messy. And they didn't fingerprint anything. They don't want to leave black smudges because that stuff's hard to get off.
So when someone gets their house broken into and nothing is stolen, yeah, the people here, we call them CCBI, the crime scene techs, and they'll give that speech. Or if someone's car is broken into and nothing is stolen, hey, we can fingerprint, but we're going to make a mess. Or do you just want to report for insurance purposes? I understand that, but we're talking about 4 people brutally murdered.
Which they didn't know at the time.
Still,
So the house was sold 4 years later. Once San Bernardino got the case, they went back to the house and they got paint chips, and they were trying to see if it had been painted over. So what the detective told me is they think that murder happened in the house and that they painted over it. And the expert for the defense testified that you can't hide blood; you'd still be able to see it.
right.
And the way that the house was, the state of the house, like there were still pine needles from Christmas, I guess, on the floor. There was still enough dirt that it was clear that no one had cleaned up. You can't selectively clean up blood spatter and not disturb the mess that was already there. They were renovating and remodeling, so there was a lot of, how messy, dirty, dusty a house gets during remodeling. And that dirt and dust and stuff was still there, and yet not a speck of blood.
Yeah, and the other thing that I kept
And wait,
on.
one thing that's
Go ahead.
always just stuck in my craw is that during the trial, one of the detectives was on the stand and the defense attorney said, "So you think that this murder occurred in the house, even though you have no physical evidence to support that?" And the guy said, "Yes." That was just classic.
Yeah, that and of how they chose to use the tower data, I thought was very interesting.
Yep.
Because people need to realize, and you did a good job explaining this, is that
Thank you.
tower data and GPS data are in total different ballparks.
And there was no GPS data
Right,
involved. Yeah.
right. If we had the GPS of his phone, we can tell you within 3 meters of where that device is. A tower, you're looking at best case scenario, because I've been on before, it looks like a dot that is, or a circle that's covering an area, and that is an estimation of the strength and location of the tower that's closest by. And in this area, it just so happens to be that this tower is on the top of the mountain. I believe it's an AT&T tower, and they were having issues with it, right?
Okay, so this is kind of tedious and complicated, but what I learned a lot about I mean, I heard this in another trial and it kind of went over, it didn't go over my head, but I didn't really believe it. But now I hear it again. And I thought, oh, this is just what defense attorneys say. No, this is actually true. People don't seem to realize that, these are not distinct and precise ways of identifying where a person is, no matter how much detectives say that we can triangulate people's location through their cell phone data. When you make a cell phone call, your phone doesn't necessarily ping on the closest tower. It could ping on one 20 miles away because the tower nearest you is busy with other calls. So when they're using the cell phone tower data to accuse him of being in a specific place, that's not real. That's not how cell towers work. And I learned that again. So that tower that was on top of the hill right near where the graves were, where they found their skeletal remains, the other thing that the defense's cell expert was supposed to testify to, but the defense attorney didn't call him. And so that is basically the basis of Chase Merritt's habeas petition that he's working on right now, inadequate counsel by the defense attorney who did not call this witness who is going to testify that that tower had two antennae that were actually malfunctioning in addition to all this other information. So it made it seem that his phone was moving in one direction when it was actually moving in the other direction. The calls that he received while he was allegedly at the gravesite were from his wife, and they didn't even connect. So there were a bunch of attempts. So it looked like he was talking to his wife, probably talking about, hey, I'm burying these bodies or whatever. They weren't even completed calls. There was a bunch of attempts because in the desert, cell phone receptivity bounces all around, and it's a very difficult place to get a call to even register and connect with a cell tower. And it also, they had some examples where it looked like he was in one place, but his phone was connecting with a tower, 20 miles away. So was his car moving in that direction, or was the cell phone just connecting with another tower? So they basically got the prosecution expert to say, you can't use these records to say that anybody was anywhere specifically. And yet the prosecution still argued that he was there burying the bodies when these calls were being made. And furthermore, the logic that he would leave his phone on while he was burying the bodies when he apparently turned his phone off for 14 hours at a time when he was allegedly cleaning up all this blood at the house, why would he turn it off for 14 hours at a time to try to hide what he was doing and then leave it on when he's burying these bodies? So that logic didn't work for me either.
And I don't want to give things away. People are going to have to buy Down to the Bone. It's available on Amazon, Barnes & Noble. There's a Kindle version as well as an Audible version. But there's other things at that grave site, at the crime scene, that point to someone else. I'll leave it at that. But there's
I
more
don't mind
than...
I don't mind touching on that. The
Can we talk
defense.
about the tire tracks?
Okay, sure. I really want to mention this DNA though, so let me just do that quickly.
Yes.
So
Go ahead.
what you were saying, and I appreciate that you don't want to give everything away, but this is really important. There were 3 DNA profiles found, according to the defense, at the gravesite on items in and outside the graves that did not match the McStay family and did not match Chase Merritt. 2 men and a woman.
And that's where I found... I don't see how you can ignore the fact that either other people are involved or we're looking at someone else. But when you're looking at the DNA, and what I found, another issue with this is that there is touch DNA that's on his vehicle that's found,
In
and
Joseph's car.
in Joseph's car, right?
As
But
a possible minor contributor, Chase Merritt's DNA was found. The major contributor, who is generally the last person to drive the car, was Joseph McStay. So as much as they made a big deal about Chase Merritt's DNA being found in that car, I still don't even see why that's important, because he said he didn't drive it and his DNA is on the steering wheel. That was
DNA
part of their
should be on the
case.
steering wheel.
Well, no, this is Chase Merritt they're
I
talking
know.
about.
Chase Merritt, if he met with Joseph McStay and
Right.
Joseph McStay was the one that, then gets in his car, if you shake hands with someone, you
And
are
that's what the
transferring
defense said.
DNA.
Right.
Right. So you should
Mhm.
have there it's a logical reason why there is
Right.
trace DNA or touch DNA on the steering wheel and on the items that someone would touch. But
Yep.
you know what? I've got to say it. If you don't want me to include it, I'll take it out. But this is what drove me nuts, and I was like banging my head on the wall.
Okay. I had a lot of
When
that. Yeah.
Chase is in the house with Michael McStay, okay, you made the comment that, and correct me if I'm wrong, that Chase does not want to touch anything, and he's kind of taken a back stance, right?
That's what Michael McStay said.
Okay. This is how I think about it, and maybe I'm just thinking about it from a cop's point of view, or if I was a criminal, what I would do. If you are in a crime scene where you are worried about your DNA being called, and you've got a reason to be there and witnesses around you, I'm touching everything in sight. I'm licking the door handle. I'm eating food. I'm like,
Yeah.
I'm like a 5-year-old at a kids museum, just smearing my hands on everything. And that way, when the detectives come by and they find my DNA, I'm like, yeah, I was here with
That
Michael.
was that was Michael McStay, because he and his mother just hated Chase Merritt. Not at that point. At that point, they were like, "Oh, he's like Joseph's best friend. He's been really helpful." But later, they turned on him. And so, in hindsight, when Michael McStay was talking about that day, Chase suddenly was this nefarious character.
And we could go on and on about this case, because there's so much to it,
Oh,
especially...
we are going to save the rest for the
Yeah,
readers
we'll
to
save
read.
the rest for people are gonna have to buy the book. Again, Down to the Bone. What's next for you, and how can we support you?
Um, I have a new thriller series launching on February 1st. The first book is called Hooked. The second book, which comes out in June, is called Staged. It's fiction. It's set in La Jolla, where I grew up. And I have two protagonists. One is a surfing homicide detective named Ken Good. And then there's a female investigative reporter. I wonder where I got that idea. That are basically working against each other and competing against each other because, police and media do not have, they're not got this camaraderie going on. They want to both protect their own information and don't want to cooperate with each other. But these two met at a bar and were immediately attracted to each other and are talking. And he doesn't know she's a reporter. He gets called out on this special death investigation to dead bodies. And so this starts this whole investigation. And then she shows up the next morning after the news conference, and he's like, "You're a reporter?" So they're both trying to solve these two crimes. And it's basically it's a series, and I've written books 3 and 4 as well. They're under submission. I'm going to publish them whether the publisher decides to publish them or not, but it's basically a series about this beautiful, beautiful place, La Jolla, California, where I grew up, and the underbelly of the corrupt, wealthy elite who control things through money and influence and power from behind the scenes.
Sounds like a great series. I'm sure, it'll turn out wonderful.
Thank you.
And so, yeah, make
Available
sure it's on
for
the lookout for that
pre-order
as well.
now.
Absolutely. So it's available on pre-order.
Yes, absolutely. Through
Okay,
Amazon.
well, there you go. Go and pre-order your copy now. And while you're at it, make sure you buy Down to the Bone. Can't recommend it enough. I know that you've got some other great books we talked about earlier. Body Parts is another great one. My brother actually taught that at his school.
Great.
Caitlin, where can we find you on social media?
I'm everywhere. I'm on Facebook and LinkedIn and Twitter, X, whatever you want to call it these days. Blue Sky. What's the other one? Threads.
Okay.
Instagram. I'm on all those.
All right. Well, I'll make sure to tag you in the post.
Okay, great. Thank you so much.
If you'd like to support me, you can buy my book, A Murder on Campus, A Professor, the Cop, and North Carolina's Most Notorious Cold Case. I did that book with my brother. It's published by Wild Blue. If you would also do me a favor and like and subscribe to this channel, Santana True Crime. You can also give us a follow on Apple and Spotify. Caitlin, thank you again.
Thank you.
Have a good night.
You too.